In the summer of 1842, the burgeoning upper-class neighbourhood of Rathmines in South Dublin was scandalised by a shocking case of murder when the decomposing body of Augustine Byrne was found in the bedroom of one of its finest rows of terraced homes, and the prime suspect was none other than his own wife, Mrs. Ellen Byrne. The unprecedented 20-day-long inquest that followed enthralled the nation as it revealed the bizarre behaviour of Ellen, who had apparently spent the previous week sharing a bed with her husband's decomposing body while consuming copious amounts of alcohol and concealing his death from her 3 sons and 2 servants with whom she shared the house. As the inquest jury members, all of whom were Ellen's neighbours, relished their task of poring over every minute detail of the crime scene and of the strange level of decomposition around the head and neck of Augustine's body, they soon came to the conclusion that his death was no accident and that Mr. Byrne had been strangled and beaten by his own wife. 1 month later, Ellen Byrne would find herself fighting for her own life in a courthouse on Green Street as a mass of people, all of whom had been greedily devouring every detail of the daily news reports from the inquest, thronged the surrounding streets in an attempt to catch a glimpse of the supposed murderess of Rathmines. The question the jury were asked on those 2 days in August 1842 was, did Ellen Byrne murder her husband in a drunken rage and cleverly conceal his body from her own family just long enough for decomposition to obscure the signs of her evil acts? Or was she a troubled but innocent woman who was so completely drunk and incoherent over the course of that week that she could not even tell that her husband lay dead beside her? Join me as I dig through the archives and investigate the truly bizarre and forgotten murder case of Ellen Byrne and her unfortunate husband, Augustine, the media frenzy and public obsession with the gruesome details of the story that enveloped Victorian Rathmines, the scandalous trial on Dublin's Green Street, and the fate of Mrs. Ellen Byrne. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next upload. These videos take weeks to research, film, narrate and edit, so I would greatly appreciate if you would consider sharing the video with a friend or family member who you think might enjoy the story. In 1842, Rathmines was an affluent and growing suburb of Dublin City, whose streets were lined with rows of fine terraced Georgian and early Victorian homes, the occasional villa and many ornate gardens that were enjoyed by the neighbourhood's wealthy residents. The Swan River that once flowed through the town had only recently disappeared underground, and many of the landmarks we recognise today were yet to be built. The fine red stone town hall and its deceitful clock that today mark the centre point of the bustling shopping district would not be built for another 54 years. On Castlewood Avenue, an open tract of marshy wasteland known as Church Fields lay on the future site of the grand Belgrave Square that came into existence a decade later. and the governing body of the Rathmines township, whose markers can be found on footpaths throughout the neighbourhood, would not be formed for another 5 years. Rathmines, it seems, was destined to become the bustling shopping town we know today, as from its earliest days, a myriad of shops began to appear on its main thoroughfare when enterprising homeowners began building retail units in the front gardens of their Georgian homes, giving Rathmines Road the form that it retains to this day. The town was, at the time, and remained so until the formation of the Free State, a unionist stronghold, with the majority of those living in its fine homes being ardent supporters of the young Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. The names given to the terraces and streets in which they lived reflected their political outlook and their position in the empire, and included Kensington Terrace, Cambridge Terrace, and Delhi Terrace, and earned it the nickname of the Dublin Belgravia. On the surface, at least, the residents of Rathmines obeyed the strict moral codes of restraint, duty, and propriety of the Victorian period. The veil of Victorian etiquette was thin, however, as behind closed doors, drunkenness, extramarital affairs, and vice were far from uncommon. It is in one of these terraced homes, in the summer of 1842, that we find the unhappily married couple of Augustine and Ellen Byrne, their 3 children, and 2 servants, at the elusive address of number 1, Albert Terrace. Ellen Byrne was in her mid-40s in 1842 and had been married to her second husband, Augustine, for the last 9 years. When the couple met, Ellen was in her early 30s, but was already a widow with 4 young children. Her first husband, Mr. Joseph Wall, had died not long after the birth of their youngest child, a boy named Valentine, leaving her to care for both him and his older siblings, Joseph, Luke, and Margaret. Although much aggrieved by the loss of her husband at such a young age, she did not have the additional worry of finding enough money to take care of her children that most young widows faced at the time, as Joseph had left in his will a significant amount of money and property to both Ellen and his children. The death did affect her greatly, however, and in the months that followed, she developed a dependency on alcohol. The young widow first encountered Augustine Byrne around 1832, and the pair instantly felt a connection. A swift marriage proposal was followed by a wedding in the Pro-Cathedral, where Ellen Wall, whose name was actually Eleanor, as we can see on the marriage register, became Mrs. Ellen Byrne, and her 4 young children gained a stepfather. Little is known of Augustine's life before he married Ellen. He was described as short and a little bit stout, and although he was not as wealthy as Ellen, he must have been from a similarly respected family for Ellen to consider him as a partner. We do know how the children felt about him, as they spoke of him with kindness and knew him by the name of Papa right up until his death. Ellen and Augustine set up home together in one of the fine Georgian townhouses of Rathmines at number 1, Albert Terrace. Over the next few years, cracks began to appear in the relationship that had begun so promisingly. Ellen's drinking developed into a daily habit, and her days often began by sending out a servant to the nearby shops on Rathmines Terrace to purchase alcohol for her. Her favourite drink was porter, but she frequently supplemented this with whiskey, ale, and wine. Most days, although quite drunk, she still managed to run the household, giving orders to her servants and arranging for the schooling of her children. Augustine, although generally sober, was also prone to bouts of excessive drinking that could last for up to a week at a time. Unlike Ellen, he would eventually come to his senses and return to sobriety for weeks or even months at a time. The children soon became accustomed to seeing both of their parents in an inebriated state. By the late 1830s, their relationship had become particularly strained. Ellen could at times be quite domineering and was often angered by Augustine's refusal to drink with her. Quarrels were not uncommon and were frequently witnessed by the children and the servants. Augustine, growing tired of dealing with Ellen's unpredictable temper, eventually took the drastic step of leaving their shared bedroom and took to sleeping in the study directly below. He added a lock to the inside of the door to prevent his wife from entering when she was drunk, as she was often verbally abusive towards him. Occasionally, when Augustine left the house, Ellen would send her young pantry boy named Thomas after him to find out where he was going. The couple would reunite periodically when Augustine took to the drink again, and they would lock themselves away from the world in Ellen's bedroom until Augustine eventually sobered up and returned to his normal life. Tragedy struck the family in 1839 when Ellen's daughter Margaret died suddenly. Joseph Wall, who had left the majority of his fortune to his wife upon his death, had also provided generously for his children, and Margaret, although very young, was in possession of £8,000, which, by virtue of his marriage to Ellen, now became the property of Augustine. We don't know how Ellen felt about this, but considering that their relationship was almost completely broken by this stage, it could easily have caused more resentment between the unhappy couple. The cycle continued for several years, and in the summer of 1842, during a long period of sobriety, Augustine began to look forward to one of the highlights of his year, the Bellowstown races, and on the last day of June, he made his way to the popular race meeting in County Meath. The excitement of the crowds, the feeling of the wind on his face as the horses surged past, and a few lucky wagers, pushed Augustine's problems to the back of his mind. And although his drinking usually led him down a dark path, he could not bear to let these rare feelings of joy slip away just yet. He made his way to the bar for the first of many celebratory drinks that, unbeknownst to him, were about to play a part in his fast approaching death. Augustine departed Bellowstown late that afternoon and began to make his way back to Rathmines. As he walked along Rathmines Road, the effects of the alcohol were wearing thin, and a depressing wave of tiredness replaced his formerly high spirits. He walked through the door of number 1 Albert Terrace at about 10 p.m. and complained to his family of feeling unwell. He poured himself several glasses of whiskey to warm himself up and retired to his room in the downstairs study. The following morning, Augustine, although still feeling ropey from the previous day's exertions, left his bedroom and had breakfast with the children. But on that day, he did not leave the house and began a habit all too familiar to his children of locking himself away in his room and ordering whiskey by the pint to be delivered to his door. The following day, Saturday, 2nd of July, Augustine was not seen to leave his room at all, and young Valentine, who was particularly fond of his stepfather, went into the study to visit his papa. He found Augustine lying on his bed on top of the sheets in a semi-dressed and dishevelled manner, as if in a drunken and aborted attempt to get dressed and leave the room. Unfortunately for Valentine, he had become accustomed to seeing both of his parents in this state, and the sight no longer shocked him. He placed a cup of tea by the bed and left the room. Augustine did not stir from his bed, except perhaps momentarily when absolutely necessary, for the next 24 hours. The next day, Sunday, 3rd of July, all three of his stepsons entered his room at various times throughout the day and found him laid out in bed in a state of utter intoxication. Meanwhile, as the boys checked on their father, Ellen too was drinking heavily in her bedroom upstairs. However, she, unlike Augustine, was not yet in a paralytic state of drunkenness. When Joseph, Luke and Valentine left their stepfather's room that day, none of them could have known that they would never see him alive again. Exactly when Ellen decided to join her husband in his study is unknown, but it was most likely late on that Sunday evening. Due to his intoxication, the door that he often locked from the inside was left open, and Ellen Byrne, carrying a large refillable beer can full of porter in her hand, entered the room, closed the door behind her, and lay down with the husband that was slipping from her grasp. From this moment on, Ellen jealously guarded the door of the study. Nobody, not even her youngest son Valentine, was permitted to enter. For the next week, Ellen kept the room in darkness, speaking to her children and servants by opening the door as little as possible so as to prevent anyone from seeing inside. A steady flow of alcohol was procured and brought to the door. Sometimes it was left on the ground. Sometimes the door opened slightly ajar, from where an arm appeared from the darkness to accept the delivery. On a few occasions, Ellen left the room briefly to take care of matters of the house. She had taken hold of the key to the study and was careful to lock the door behind her, even though she planned to return only minutes later. Despite her continuous drinking, Ellen always managed to remain competent enough to deal with servants and her children, and this she did over the week that followed when it was asked of her. As the week rolled on, the boys got used to speaking to their mother through a narrow gap in the door. At no time did they catch a glimpse of, or hear a single word spoken by their stepfather. In Rathmines, Augustine's friends began to comment on his absence, but there was little concern, as he had often gone missing before, only to reappear a week or so later. For Joseph, Luke and Valentine too, however strange the situation was, they had seen it all before. Only a few months previously, the dysfunctional couple had disappeared into Ellen's room together to drink themselves senseless for a week, before eventually returning to normality. As the week drew to a close, the Byrne's next-door neighbour, Paul Barry Esquire, was sitting in his drawing room of number 2 Albert Terrace. He had become accustomed over the years to hearing raised voices travel through the walls of the terrace. He knew well of Augustine and Ellen's drinking habits and sometimes erratic behaviour, as did everybody else in Rathmines. This week had been relatively quiet since Sunday night, when he had heard a heated argument and foul language coming from next door. This had been late in the evening, after Ellen had joined Augustine in his study. On Friday evening, his peace was once again disturbed, not by a muffled argument, but by a deeply unpleasant smell that lingered in the air of his opulent drawing room. A fruitless search of the house to see where this smell could be emanating from drew a blank. He stepped out into the back garden to get some fresh air, but there the smell got even stronger. It seemed to Paul Barry Esquire that it must be coming from the house next door. At 5 p.m. on Saturday evening, a week after Augustine and Ellen disappeared into his room, Luke heard his mother call out his name from the study. As he approached the door, expecting to be handed an empty beer can to be refilled, he was instead surprised when Ellen beckoned him into the room she had been guarding so closely and asked him to check on his stepfather. Before he took a step towards the bed, a foul smell filled his nostrils and turned his stomach. He approached the bed to see Augustine lying face down. The visible skin on the nape of his neck and ears looked strange and discoloured. There was no movement or sign of life. He hurried out of the room to tell his older brother what he had seen. Joseph and Luke lifted their stepfather and lay him on his back. Augustine was barely recognisable. His skin was a colour they had never seen before, and his body was in a state of putrid decomposition. The brothers turned to their mother and told her that he was dead. She replied simply, "No, he is not." The local doctor was immediately sent for, with word that Augustine was in a dire state. When Arthur Harvey Esquire of Rathmines arrived expecting to find a seriously ill man, he was instead presented with a body that had clearly been dead for many days. The discovery shocked and unnerved Harvey, How was it possible, he asked himself, for a body to be in this state, in a house full of people, and with the wife who had apparently been sharing a bed with the victim for the past week? Why, in God's name, he thought, had Ellen not called out sooner to her family for help when there was still a chance to save her husband? Harvey stepped out of the house to gather his thoughts on that warm Saturday evening in July. He then hurried along Rathmines Avenue to the nearby police station to alert Inspector Finnemore of the mysterious death, who in turn contacted the county coroner, Mr. McCarthy. Shortly afterwards, the men reconvened at Albert Terrace, and after inspecting the disturbing scene, the coroner summoned a jury to assemble at the house, announcing that an inquest into the strange death of Augustine Byrne was to begin on Monday morning, the 11th of July, 1842. The Byrne family would have little time to mourn the death of Augustine, as their world and their home were about to be turned upside down by an unprecedented and highly invasive 20-day-long inquiry held in the house while they continued to live there, and every minute and gory detail of which was to be published in newspapers across Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales. Soon the public would be frothing at the mouth to learn more of the dysfunctional private life of the Byrne family, and the peaceful summer evenings being enjoyed by the residents of Rathmines that summer were replaced by crowds of morbidly curious onlookers who gathered in the streets outside Albert Terrace in the hopes of catching a glimpse of the unfortunate family. The first newspaper article appeared on Monday morning following the discovery on Saturday and read as follows: Most mysterious occurrence. Surgeon Harvey, with great promptitude, hastened to the house and on being ushered into the back drawing room, found Mr. Byrne dead, and from the appearance of the body, he must have been dead for some days. A more horrifying spectacle could not have been witnessed. The face was black and swollen, and the features could hardly be recognised, while the body was also much discoloured and swollen. Sufficient appeared to lead to the communication of the matter to the police, and Mr. McCarthy, the county coroner, having been sent for at a late hour, swore a jury, but adjourned the hearing of the evidence. The police are placed in care of the house. Yesterday, Sunday, surgeons Mitchell, Ellis, Fox and others attended a post-mortem examination, and the contents of the stomach were removed in order to have them analysed. The medical gentlemen state that the body was in a very decomposed state, and the smell so great as to be observed prior to the death being known by the family in the adjoining house. Ellen appeared to be in a state of utter confusion. She reeked of alcohol and initially claimed to have been completely unaware of her husband's death, but in the eyes of the authorities and the general public, she was about to become the prime suspect in the murder of Augustine Byrne. On Monday morning next, a jury of 12 men, all of whom were neighbours of and knew the family, dutifully assembled at number 1 Albert Terrace to begin their investigations. Leading the inquiry was the county coroner, Mr. James McCarthy, and the police investigation was led by Inspector Finnemore and assisted by Constable Muldoon, both of Rathmines Police Station. The role of the jury was to determine whether Augustine's death was the result of natural causes or foul play, and if the latter had taken place, to decide who was responsible. The members of the jury began to pick through every piece of evidence they could find in the house. Augustine's bedsheets, pillows and clothing were closely examined, and all the members of the household were questioned about the events of the previous week. It is fair to say that the jury relished this opportunity to play detective and to pry into the private life of Ellen and Augustine. They devoted entire days to examining small and irrelevant details, often without revealing anything of value, and as public interest grew, people began to crowd into the house to watch the proceedings. A bolster on Augustine's bed became the focus of the jury's attention when what appeared to be spots of blood were seen on the material. But after hours of discussion, it was decided to be of no importance to the case. Likewise, one jury member raised the issue of Augustine's missing shirt sleeve, but this too was dismissed when another juror revealed that they had requested it to be removed from the body so they could inspect it closer. Once again, this revealed nothing of value. The three boys, Joseph, Luke and Valentine Wall, along with servants Christopher Tolt, Catherine Finnegan and a parlour boy named Thomas McDonough, were all questioned on the week's events and on Ellen's behaviour. They all told of the shocking amounts of alcohol that were ordered up to the room. Whiskey by the pint, porter and wine were purchased by servants in Rathmines and delivered to the door of the study. As the week went on, Ellen ordered the servants to stay away from the study, and the boys took over the responsibility of refilling her beer can and bringing whatever small amounts of food she requested. No matter who Ellen opened the door to that week, she made sure to position her body in such a way as to prevent them from seeing inside. On one occasion, Valentine was asked to fetch a cup of tea to bring to his mother. When he found that there were no more cups in the kitchen, he knocked on the study door, and Ellen passed a used cup to him through the narrowest of gaps. As he walked back down to the kitchen, he noticed that the residue in the cup seemed to be darker than usual. The jury immediately questioned whether this residue could be a sign of poison. The autopsy had uncovered no evidence of poisoning, but the doctors noted that due to the level of decomposition, it was almost impossible to be certain about anything. The question was asked, would a mother hand her youngest child a cup containing deadly poison, knowing that he was likely to wash the cup himself? Once again, it was decided that this was unlikely, and the theory was dismissed. An insight into the strange relationship between the couple and their drinking habits was gained when 17-year-old Luke was interviewed by the jury. He told of how he had often seen Augustine carry his mother up the stairs to her bed when she was too drunk to walk, how he took bottles of whiskey from her room to prevent her from drinking them, how Ellen often verbally abused her husband at the dinner table, and Augustine, when sober, did not respond to her taunts, but when drunk himself would answer back, and a quarrel would inevitably ensue. Despite his mother's temper, Luke did not recall seeing his mother physically attack Augustine. Valentine was also questioned by the jury in an interview that lasted over 3 hours. I think I am 10 years old. I live here. I am stepson of the late Mr. Byrne. I was very much attached to him. Dada, Mr. Byrne that is, brought me home from school. I saw Dada on Saturday after he came back from Bellowstown. He was lying on his bed, the little bed he died on. I do not think that my papa was cheerful. I think my mama was in his bedroom on Sunday. I think I heard my papa bawling in the room on Sunday. I think I saw my mama that day at the pantry door. She gave me money to go to prayers with my brothers, but we were too late. I think my mama was angry with us for not being in time for mass. I knew it was my dada I heard bawling. I think one of my brothers went to the side of the door to listen to what it was. I heard my brother tap at the door. I did not hear any bawling after that. My brother came down after that. He asked what the bawling was, but he was not let in. I went up part of the stairs with my brother. Saw him give another tap. There was not a word from inside, and we walked down again. I know the door was locked, for when it is shut, it is locked. You can open the door inside without a key, but from the outside you could not. I could not tell what day I saw my mama next. Later I went up to mama to ask for the teacup. She opened the door so little more than the teacup could come out. She handed me the cup herself. I could see no more of the room than the ceiling, for my mama was squeezed up against the door for fear I would look in. The room was dark. It was just so that you could barely see the ceiling. Later I rapped at the door once or twice. My mama asked me what I wanted. I said, the beer can. She opened the door and gave it to me. The door was locked. When she gave the can to me, she opened the door barely, so that the can could go out. She clapped the door shut then, and did not say anything to me. When giving the can out, she stood against the door, the way that I could see nothing at all. The jury were intrigued by and highly suspicious of Ellen's secrecy, and each witness gave exactly the same account of her efforts to prevent anyone from seeing what had happened in the room. What was it that she was so keen to hide, and what exactly was the cause of Augustine's bawling that had been heard by her sons and the next door neighbour, Paul Barry? The questioning of a young pantry boy named Thomas McDonough, who worked for the family, gave further insight into Ellen's volatile temper. He told the jury of the many trips he made to the wine merchants of Rathmines to fetch whiskey, rum, wine, brandy and porter for his master and his mistress. It was also revealed to the jury that Thomas had told a neighbour of the Byrnes, named Mr. Holmes, that he had witnessed a violent argument between the pair, during which Ellen had physically attacked and even thrown a knife at Augustine. However, at the inquest, he retracted this statement, even though it was shown to the jury that he had given a sworn statement to Inspector Finnemore that said the incident had taken place. Ellen maintained that she had no knowledge of her husband's death until the following Saturday, when she eventually allowed Luke into the room. She told the jury that she had been in a state of utter drink-induced senselessness for the entirety of the week, and could not believe that Augustine had been dead for that long. There was no question that Ellen had consumed a staggering amount of alcohol that week, but this was something she regularly did, and the jury had great difficulty believing that she could share the room and even the bed with Augustine for that length of time without realising he was dead. Her secrecy was so great that for a full week she did not allow the chamber pots in the study to be emptied even once, an act that may have delayed the other members of the household from realising what the real source of the bad smell was. There were several problems with her explanation, however. Not only had Ellen been sober enough to interact with her children and servants, she had, on one occasion, been able to haggle with a fishmonger that called to the door of the house. The man had 3 trout to sell and was asking a shilling for them. When her son went to the study door to ask if Ellen wanted the fish, she said that she would pay no more than 10 pence. She said she did not have the money on her to pay that day, and told him to leave the fish and return the following day for payment. On Saturday, she sent down for 2 cups of tea and 2 plates of buttered bread to be sent to the study, giving the impression that the meal was for 2 people. But by the time both of these events occurred, Augustine was almost certainly dead and decomposing in the bed. On the Saturday evening when the body was discovered, Ellen had initially told Inspector Finnemore that she did not believe that Augustine was dead, yet she seemed to contradict herself only moments later. It was noted by the inspector and the coroner that Augustine's eye and tongue were protruding from the body. Ellen was still in the room at the time, and she interjected, "He looked like that 5 minutes after he died." How could she possibly know this if she was unaware of his death? The condition of Augustine's body was the most significant cause of suspicion, however. Protrusion of the eyes and the tongue is often seen as a sign of death by strangulation, and the alarmingly high level of decomposition around the neck and head of the victim seemed to suggest that it had been caused by violence at the time of death. As the lengthy inquest rolled on, patience began to wear thin, even among the journalists who were covering the story. Eventually, 20 days after the jury had begun their investigations, they revealed their findings, and they were reported as follows in the newspapers the following day. The late mysterious murder. Termination of the inquest. At last, this investigation has dragged its weary length to a conclusion. The jury assembled at the regular place, and the coroner proceeded to address them as follows. Gentlemen of the jury, it only remains for me to draw your attention to the issue upon which you have to find a verdict in this case. It is this: whether you believe that Mrs. Byrne was or was not in a sound state of mind during the time that she was with the late Mr. Byrne in the room. I think your verdict should go no farther than, in the first case, that suspicion attaches that Mr. Byrne died by violence and that Mrs. Byrne was privy thereto. If you believe that she was in an unusual state of mind on the occasion and did not know what occurred, you will of course acquit her. If you believe otherwise, you will find accordingly. It is unnecessary for me to go over the evidence, as you have taken copious notes. The room was then cleared of strangers, and the jury were shut up at 7 o'clock, and after remaining behind closed doors until 11, they returned the following verdict. We find that Mr. Augustine Byrne was found dead in his bed at number 1 Albert Terrace, Rathmines, in the parish of St. Peter and the county of Dublin, upon Saturday the 9th of July 1842, and we find that said Mr. Augustine Byrne met with his death between the 3rd of July and the 9th of July under very suspicious circumstances, and that the strongest possible suspicions attached to Mrs. Ellen Byrne, wife of said Augustine Byrne of said house, of being accessory to. The jury were convinced that Ellen Byrne had murdered her husband by strangulation and had gone through great lengths to hide the scene of the crime for as long as she could bear, to allow his body to decompose and thus hide the evidence of her crimes. The question was, could their suspicions be proven in a court of law, or had Ellen skillfully covered her tracks? The following day, Ellen was admitted to bail by the coroner after she paid a bond of £3,000, which she could easily afford, and she was able to remain in her home, although in the custody of the police, to await her trial for the murder of her husband, which, if found guilty, carried a sentence of death by hanging. The crowds that had been gathering each day in the streets of Rathmines during the inquest now shifted their focus to the courthouse on Green Street in preparation for the most sensational trial of the year, the Queen versus Ellen Byrne. On Friday the 12th of August 1842, a grand jury declared to the court on Green Street that a true bill had been found against Ellen Byrne, and Judge Penfather summoned her to appear in the court that very evening. Inspector Finnemore left Green Street for Rathmines. The streets outside the court were thronged almost to the point of suffocation, and the news of a true bill being found electrified the crowd. At 6 p.m, a shout rang out from Little Britain Street when her carriage was spotted. Inspector Finnemore pushed on through the crowd and brought Ellen to the door of Newgate Prison, next to the courthouse, from where they made their way to the courtroom. Ellen, dressed in black from head to toe, was placed at the Traverser's bar in front of a packed courtroom. A reporter described her appearance as follows. She appears to be about 45 years of age and is a person of very interesting appearance. She must have been, at an early period of her life, extremely handsome. She has fine eyes with jet black hair, which hung in luxuriant curls about her still rosy cheeks. She appeared very much affected, but firm and self-composed at the same time, far beyond what might be expected from a person in her situation. She sat down for a brief period. When the clerk of the Crown requested she would stand up, she did so, crying bitterly. She stood quite firm and composed amid a death-like silence, and listened as she was charged with the murder of her husband. The trial was set to begin the following Monday morning at 10 a.m. sharp, and Ellen was ordered to be taken to Kilmainham jail to await its commencement. The excitement of the crowds outside had not abated, and they pushed up against the railings on Green Street, fearing a riot might take place when they tried to convey Ellen to Kilmainham. A ruse had to be deployed to separate the crowds. A number of mounted police were sent to the rear of the court on Halston Street to trick the crowd into thinking Ellen was to be brought out that way. When they took the bait, Ellen was rushed out the front door on Green Street into a covered car and was driven away at speed in the company of Inspector Finnemore and Mr. Allison, the governor of Kilmainham jail. Realising they had just been swindled, the frenzied crowd gave chase to the car, shouting and hooting in the most violent manner. On Monday morning, the 15th of August, the crowds once again gathered on Green Street, the most eager of them having come several hours early to secure a much coveted spot in the public gallery. Also waiting in the court were Mr. Brewster QC, Mr. Martley QC and Mr. McCain QC, who were counsel for the Crown. Mr. McDonough and Mr. Curran were counsel for the next of kin of the deceased, and Ellen was represented by Mr. Hatchell QC, Mr. Fitzgibbon QC and Mr. Walsh. Presiding over the court were Chief Justice Doherty and Baron Penfather. At 9 a.m, a covered car departed Kilmainham. Inside were Ellen Byrne and Inspector Finnemore. This time they were accompanied by Mr. Allison Jr., son of the governor of Kilmainham jail. A posse of mounted police was necessary to ensure the car would make it through the crowds. As they entered the court, Ellen leaned on the arm of Mr. Allison Jr. as he helped her to step into the dock. A ripple of excitement travelled through the public gallery when Ellen came into their view. She was attired in a suit of the deepest weeds, made according to the most modern fashion, and wore a double veil of dense crepe, which, when lifted, fell about her face in such thick drapery as to render her face almost invisible. In her hand she held a rich bouquet, and her demeanour throughout the whole proceedings was characterised by the most unruffled composure and the utmost self-possession. She walked into the dock with a firm, unbroken step, and on no occasion, except perhaps at the moment when the indictment was being read, did she exhibit the slightest trepidation. Clerk of the Crown. Ellen Byrne, are you ready for your trial? Yes. Clerk of the Crown. Those gentlemen in the box are to try you for your life, and if you have any objection to them, you have the right to challenge 20 of them, and as many as you can show cause for. The court directed that nobody from Rathmines was eligible for jury service, and Ellen's defence challenged 15 jurors. Soon the following 12 men were sworn in: William Alder of Merrion, John Brierly of Clontarf, Thomas McGreary of Charlemont Street, Archibald Ferguson of Monkstown, John Fortune of Rathdown, George Fagan of Kingstown, Robert Kelly of Sydney Avenue, Irwin Smith of Kingstown, James Rowe of Carrisford Avenue, John Bond of Crumlin, John Moylan of Kingstown, and Robert Hull of Grand Canal. Ellen Byrne, not having the fear of God before your eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, did on the 3rd of July in the 6th year of the reign of Queen Victoria I, feloniously and wilfully and with malice and aforethought, did make an assault on one Augustine Byrne, your late husband, and then and there, feloniously and wilfully and of your malice and aforethought, did fix and fasten both your hands about the neck and throat of the said Augustine Byrne, and did choke and strangle, of which choking and strangling he, the said Augustine Byrne, died. The second count charges the prisoner with kicking and beating Mr. Byrne on the head, neck and belly and other parts of the body with their hands and feet, and casting and throwing him upon a certain bed with great force and violence, and thereby inflicting several mortal wounds and bruises of which he died. The third count charges her with fastening a linen cloth about his neck, and thereby choking and strangling him These charges were followed by 9 more describing various types of strangulation and suffocation that the prosecution believed may have been inflicted on Augustine, all of which underlined the uncertainty of what specific method Ellen had used to murder her husband. Mr. Brewster QC, speaking on behalf of the prosecution, then outlined the difficulties the jury were about to face in deciding how Augustine died due to the shocking state of the body by the time it was discovered. He spoke of how they would learn of Ellen's scandalous drunkenness, yet reminded them that this was not the reason she was on trial. He told the jury how the most deplorable circumstance of this case was that the prisoner's own sons were amongst the principal witnesses against her. One by one, Joseph, Luke and Valentine Wall were questioned on the stand on what they remembered of their mother's behaviour that week, and each of them gave the same accounts they had at the inquest regarding Ellen's strange and suspicious attempts to keep them out of the study. Of particular interest to the prosecution was the apparent deception undertaken by Ellen on the morning of the final Saturday, when she ordered 2 cups of tea and 2 plates of buttered bread to the room to make it seem like the meal was for 2, when Augustine had been dead in his bed for the previous 4 to 5 days. Her claims of being distressed and senseless and unaware of his death were somewhat undermined when she had let slip that the protrusion of Augustine's eye and tongue had been visible 5 minutes after he died, meaning she had clearly ordered the tea and bread when she knew he was dead. The prosecution also drew particular attention to the unusually high level of decomposition that had occurred around the head and neck, which, in their opinion, could only have been caused by an act of violence. Yet they admitted that the evidence given by the medical men who carried out the autopsy could not back up their theory, as the actual signs of strangulation had utterly decomposed by the time Ellen allowed her sons into the room. The most vital opinions of the entire trial were to be those of the doctors who inspected the body of Augustine Byrne, yet despite their best efforts and detailed investigations, they found it to be simply impossible to say with any certainty whether Augustine had died by strangulation, as the level of decomposition was just too advanced. The autopsy had ruled out the use of poison, but they could not say whether Augustine had been given any narcotic substances either. The decision was now left in the hands of the jury. Had Augustine Byrne simply died in his bed of natural causes and gone unnoticed for a full week, or had he been violently murdered by his wife, who then went to great lengths to hide the crime from her own family? Was the protrusion of his eye and tongue a telling sign of strangulation, or was it simply the result of decomposition? Given that a guilty verdict would result in a sentence of death for Ellen, the judge instructed the jury that if there was any doubt in their minds, they were to acquit her of murder. He asked them to put out of their minds all the stories they had heard during the inquest regarding Ellen's drinking habits, but instead to focus on what had occurred in the fatal den of filth and infamy that was Augustine's study. At 3:40 p.m. on the second day of the trial, the jury retired to their room to make their difficult decision. A long wait was expected by all who had gathered in the courtroom, but only 30 minutes later, the jury made a surprise reappearance. "We, the jury, find Ellen Byrne not guilty." Ellen was saved from the hangman's noose. A murmur of dissatisfaction rippled through the court, while a number of Ellen's supporters burst into a round of applause. She was immediately freed from custody and walked out through the front door, a free woman. On Green Street, she hurriedly climbed into a waiting covered car and headed straight for the train station. There was simply no prospect of Ellen returning to Rathmines, as despite the verdict of innocence, she had become a figure of significant notoriety. She disembarked the train in Kingstown and boarded a packet ship destined for Liverpool, where she hoped nobody would recognise her. Ellen's legal troubles were not over just yet, as within a few weeks she would once again find herself in court. Following her return to Dublin a few weeks later, Augustine's sisters, Marianne and Teresa, took her to court as they believed she was hiding money and property that belonged to Augustine. They also informed the court of their belief that Ellen was an unfit mother and that Valentine should be removed from her care. Ellen, who had taken up lodgings in Phibsborough, had made an agreement with Augustine when they married that in the event of his death she could choose to either inherit his estate and pay a sum of £3,000 to his sisters, or take the £3,000 herself and allow the sisters to take whatever money or property was left. Ellen elected to take the £3,000 and give up any claim to the rest of Augustine's estate. She told the court that Augustine had been living the high life and had burnt through nearly everything he owned. All the property and money that remained was Ellen's. Mary Ann and Teresa disputed this, saying that Augustine was still in possession of a significant amount of property when he died, and that Ellen was not being honest with the court. The judge dismissed the sisters' claim that Ellen was an unfit mother, but he did agree that Ellen was not to be trusted as the administrator of the estate, and instead gave the responsibility to Mary Ann's husband, Christopher. Just 1 week later, Ellen was once again placed under arrest, this time at her lodgings in Phibsborough, after Mary Ann accused her of stealing 3 gold watches, 3 diamond rings, and many more valuable items from the Byrne home at Albert Terrace. It was revealed that Ellen had set out from Phibsborough one evening in the company of 2 accomplices and had returned to the family home, where she took the items and told a caretaker to keep her visit a secret. In Ellen's eyes, she was simply taking her own possessions from her own home, but as the estate had not yet been settled, she technically had no right to do so. Mary Ann brought her to court once again, but Ellen was released when she told the judge that she had taken the items under instruction from her lawyer. Following this dispute, Ellen Byrne faded into obscurity as the newspapers lost interest in her legal troubles, and no more articles were written about her or her husband. As the years passed by, the drama and scandal she created that summer was slowly forgotten. Augustine Byrne died aged 38 in July 1842. Do you think that Ellen was an innocent woman and that the jury made the right decision? Or was she, in fact, a murderer who successfully covered her tracks and then expertly played the role of the grieving widow in court while wearing her finest weeds and clutching her bouquet of flowers? Have your say in the comments section below.